Chernobyl. Just one word, and it sends a chill down your spine. Movies, TV series, history books, all of them talk about this disaster. But here's what most people don't know. Chernobyl wasn't the first, and it wasn't even the most secret nuclear accident. Over the last 70 years, the world has experienced at least 7 major nuclear disasters, accidents that governments worked hard to keep hidden for years. Some of them were even worse than Chernobyl. People died in unimaginable agony, and no one knew why. Workers absorbed lethal doses of radiation to protect others. Their names were classified, their stories erased. Today, we'll tell you the stories that will completely change how you see nuclear safety, stories of heroism, criminal negligence, and how one single mistake can cost thousands of lives. Let's start with the nuclear accident the Soviet government kept secret the longest, 32 years. Just think about that, 32 years of silence. On September 29, 1957, at 4:22 p.m. local time, in Russia's Chelyabinsk region, near the closed city of Ozyorsk, known back then as Chelyabinsk 40, a disaster occurred at a secret facility called Mayak. This plant produced plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons. And of course, the authorities told the public nothing. Inside one of the radioactive waste storage units, the cooling system failed. Tank number 14 contained 70 to 80 tons of nuclear waste, accumulated since 1949. A deadly mix of strontium, cesium, cerium, and zirconium, isotopes emitting extreme levels of radiation. The cooling system had been malfunctioning for over a year, but proper repairs were deemed too expensive, so nothing was done. Eventually, temperatures rose to nearly 200 degrees Celsius, causing the sodium nitrates and acetates inside the tank to react. At 4:23 p.m., the tank exploded. A concrete lid weighing 160 tons was blown 25 meters into the air. Steel debris scattered across 150 meters, leaving behind a crater 10 meters deep. An estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material were released into the atmosphere. A massive cloud of smoke and dust rose over a kilometer high. The glow was so intense that residents believed they were witnessing the northern lights. To put this into perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima released about 3 to 4 million curies. The Kyshtym disaster was 5 times more powerful. And the worst part? No one was warned. People continued their daily lives, working, breathing, raising children, while radioactive fallout drifted northeast, contaminating 4,000 square kilometers. 270,000 people were exposed. Evacuations happened quietly. No explanations, no warnings. Doctors diagnosed victims with nervous disorders and fatigue syndromes. In reality, people were dying from acute radiation sickness. The Soviet Union officially admitted the disaster only in 1989, 32 years later. Before that, the city of Ozyorsk didn't even exist on maps. Those who helped evacuate residents and clean up the aftermath absorbed lethal radiation doses. Over 1,000 internal security soldiers were irradiated. Many later died from cancer, and for decades, their sacrifice was never acknowledged. October 10, 1957, Cumbria, northwest England. Less than a month after the Kyshtym disaster, another nuclear accident occurred, this time in Britain. But unlike the Soviets, the British preferred not to talk about it at all. At the Sellafield nuclear complex, back then known as Windscale, one of the 2 reactors was undergoing a routine procedure called graphite annealing. It didn't sound dangerous, but in reality, it was extremely risky. As a reactor operates, neutrons bombard the graphite moderator, causing it to store energy. To release that energy and restore the graphite structure, the reactor must be heated to a precise temperature. Here's the problem. Due to calculation errors and the lack of proper temperature monitoring equipment, the reactor overheated. The uranium fuel began to oxidize. In simple terms, it caught fire. More than 150 fuel channels ignited, containing nearly 8 tons of uranium. The reactor burned for 2 full days. Engineers tried to extinguish the fire using carbon dioxide. It didn't work. The flames only grew stronger. By October 11th, there was only one option left: flood the reactor with water. The operator knew exactly how dangerous that was. Cold water hitting red-hot uranium could trigger an explosion, but there was no choice. They began pumping in water. And somehow, miraculously, the explosion never came. The reactor slowly cooled. Around 20,000 curies of iodine-131 were released into the atmosphere. And here's the shocking part. British newspapers barely mentioned it. Officially, it was labeled a minor incident. In reality, it was the worst nuclear accident in the history of the British nuclear industry. March 28, 1979, 4 a.m., 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant, Pennsylvania. At the time, it was the most advanced nuclear facility in the United States, the pride of American nuclear energy. And nearby, nearly 7 million people, one of the most densely populated regions in the country. It all started with something small. A failure in the cooling monitoring system caused water to slowly leak from the reactor. Operators didn't immediately realize what was happening. Within minutes, temperatures began to rise. The reactor started to melt. Nuclear fuel, normally solid rods, began melting at 1,200 degrees Celsius, like wax from a candle. Within hours, 50% of the reactor core had melted. Half of it. That's catastrophic. But one thing may have saved the United States from a full-scale nuclear disaster: the containment structure. A massive shell of steel and concrete, several meters thick, did exactly what it was designed to do. It prevented most of the radiation from escaping. Yes, some radioactive steam and gas were released, but compared to what could have happened, it was minimal. Still, radioactive steam clouds rose into the sky. 140,000 people were evacuated. Families fled their homes in panic, convinced the world was ending. Some feared it was the beginning of World War III. Cleanup and repairs took 14 years and cost $1 billion. But here's the key difference. 3 Mile Island was an accident, but it was controlled. The safety systems worked. This wasn't a massive catastrophe. It was a warning. Afterward, the United States dramatically tightened nuclear safety regulations. Every nuclear plant was inspected. Design flaws were exposed. And one terrifying question remains: what if the containment structure had failed, even slightly? What if the radioactive cloud had drifted toward major cities? That's something too frightening to imagine. Disaster number 4, Chalk River, December 12, 1952, Chalk River, Canada, just 160 kilometers from Ottawa. At Canada's National Research Laboratories, something happened that had never occurred before: the world's first partial nuclear reactor meltdown. The NRX reactor was operating at full power. Due to control system failures and human error, the reactor slipped out of control and began to accelerate. Power levels kept climbing. Safety systems tried to shut it down. Alarms were screaming. Nothing worked. In a matter of seconds, output surged from a normal 1 megawatt to 60, even 90 megawatts. The reactor core and graphite moderator were severely damaged. The reactor was completely disabled. Around 10,000 curies of radioactive material mixed with cooling water flooded the basement of the facility. That's over 1 million gallons of radioactive contamination. Some of it leaked into the Ottawa River and the surrounding area. Radiation spread beyond the site. For the first time in history, a nuclear reactor had to be completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. 2 years later, it was repaired and brought back online. But the message was clear. A reactor meltdown wasn't science fiction. It was real. Disaster number 5, K-19, July 4, 1961. The Atlantic Ocean. Soviet submarine K-19, the USSR's first ballistic missile submarine. On board, 138 crew members. 8 nuclear missiles, each with a nuclear warhead. The submarine was patrolling dangerously close to a U.S. naval base. The Cold War was at its peak. At 9:00 p.m., the cooling system of Reactor 1 failed. Coolant began leaking. Temperatures skyrocketed. If the reactor overheated, it would explode inside the submarine. The nearest U.S. base was just 70 miles away, and it was Independence Day. A reactor explosion would create a radioactive cloud drifting toward the United States. It could easily be mistaken for a nuclear attack. The commander of K-19 understood the stakes. The reactor had to be cooled, immediately. There was only one option: manually weld a pipe to the reactor and pump cold seawater through it. That meant entering the reactor compartment. Radiation levels inside were hundreds of times above lethal limits. Young sailors stepped forward, one by one. They wore thin rubber suits, the best protection available at the time, and gas masks. Inside the compartment, temperatures reached 70 degrees Celsius. You couldn't see the radiation, but it was killing them. They came out barely alive. Then others took their place and finished the job. The reactor was saved. Within 3 weeks, 8 men died from acute radiation sickness. Their bodies shut down. Organs failed. The pain was unimaginable. Each had received over 200 Roentgens in a very short time. A fatal dose. In hospital records, doctors wrote, "nervous disorder." They knew the truth, but they were ordered to stay silent. The survivors were forced to sign 30-year non-disclosure agreements. Only decades later did the world learn the truth. Those 8 men may have saved millions of lives, and possibly prevented a major war. Disaster number 6, Tokaimura, September 30th, 1999. Tokai Village, Ibaraki Prefecture, Japan. A small facility called JCO. Not a nuclear power plant, just a fuel processing factory. They worked with uranium, producing fuel for an experimental reactor called Joyo. On paper, it sounded harmless, but it wasn't. 3 workers were performing a routine task: mixing uranium with acid in special tanks. According to safety rules, the amount of uranium was strictly limited. not enough to trigger a nuclear chain reaction. That's why the tanks were tall and narrow, and the settling tank was cooled. Everything was designed to prevent criticality. But 3 years earlier, management decided to cut corners. Without authorization, they changed the process. Instead of using proper equipment, workers mixed uranium in buckets and then poured it into the settling tank by hand. That day, one worker poured in the 7th bucket of uranyl nitrate. That was enough. A self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction began. The worker saw a strange blue flash, Cherenkov radiation, a very bad sign. Another worker was standing nearby. Both immediately felt it. Burning sensations, nausea, difficulty breathing. They knew something had gone terribly wrong, but there was nothing they could do. The reaction continued for almost 24 hours. Gamma radiation levels within a 350-meter radius increased 1,000 times, reaching 0.5 millisieverts per hour. Authorities evacuated 161 residents from nearby homes. In total, 667 people were exposed to radiation: workers, firefighters, emergency responders, and civilians. The 3 workers received lethal doses. 2 of them died after weeks of extreme suffering. 1 survived, permanently injured. Disaster There 7. Chazhma Bay, August 10, 1985. Chazhma Bay, Sea of Japan. Soviet nuclear submarine. K-431 was undergoing routine maintenance at a shipyard. Its nuclear reactors were being refueled. The operation was behind schedule. Command was pushing the crew to hurry. As workers lifted the lid of the left reactor to access the fuel, something went wrong. A passing boat created a wave. The wave rocked the floating crane holding the reactor lid. The lid shifted. At that exact moment, the control grid and absorber rods, designed to suppress the reaction, were pulled upward. A massive positive reactivity spike entered the reactor. An uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction began. In milliseconds, the reactor released enough energy to instantly vaporize the coolant. Pressure skyrocketed. A thermal explosion followed. Radiation levels at the epicenter reached 90,000 roentgens per hour. For comparison, at Chernobyl, maximum levels near the ruins reached 30,000 roentgens. This accident was 3 times worse than Chernobyl. At 90,000 roentgens per hour, death doesn't come in hours. It comes in minutes. 11 people near the reactor were killed instantly. 350 tons of radioactive water spilled into the bay. The pier, the shipyard, and the shoreline were contaminated. Cleanup crews worked with little to no protection. According to witnesses, dosimeters simply stopped working. Radiation levels were off the scale. Unlike K-19, the Chazhma Bay disaster was buried even deeper. The world only learned about it in the 1990s. And here's the chilling detail. The accident happened on August 10, 1985. Exactly 10 months later, on April 26, 1986, Chernobyl exploded. 7 disasters. 7 reminders of how dangerous nuclear energy can be. Kyshtym was hidden for 32 years. K-19 for 30 years. Chazhma Bay until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Windscale was barely mentioned in Britain and quietly forgotten. But the real tragedy isn't just the accidents themselves, it's the silence. Scientists and engineers learned from every disaster. After K-19, submarine cooling systems were improved. After 3 Mile Island, containment structures were reinforced. After Tokaimura, nuclear regulations across Japan were tightened. But each country learned alone, without sharing knowledge with the rest of the world. If governments had been honest about Chalk River, Kyshtym, and Chazhma Bay from the start, thousands of lives might have been saved. Maybe even Chernobyl, which happened just 10 months after Chazhma, could have been prevented. We'll never know. If you believe the truth about nuclear safety should be known, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Remember, safety isn't boring paperwork. It's a choice between life and death for millions of people. Thank you for watching.